Okay, welcome to the Board of Equalization. Please introduce yourselves for the record.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. My name is Marty Dakessian, and I'm with the law firm of Reed Smith, and I represent the taxpayer in this case, GNC Equipment Corporation. Seated with me at the council table is Mr. Gene Hale, the President and CEO of GNC Equipment Corporation, and seated to his left is my Reed Smith colleague, Mr. Mike Shake.
Let me have Mr. Shea kind of angle his mic just a little bit so that he doesn't have to bend in. You can pull it forward. There you go. Okay. At your convenience.
Mr. Chairman and members, GNC Equipment Corporation is in the business of leasing construction equipment and providing personnel for various construction projects and job sites throughout the country. The nature of the business is such that the projects and the mix of goods and services provided for a given job site differ from contract to contract and from quarter to quarter based on the location, the needs of the particular client and customer and so forth. And those differences are in fact reflected on the sales tax returns and the way that the numbers flow from quarter to quarter throughout the audit period. The audit period here is from the second quarter of 2002 until the first quarter of 2005. And if I may, the timeline that we have up here shows the events that led up to where we are today, the point in time that we are today. As you can see up here, and this is also behind tab 1 of the materials that we provided, in case this print is a little hard to read, the audit began back in July of 2005, 10 years ago. And throughout the course of the 10 years that have ensued that lead up to today, there's one issue left that's before the board. And this issue is claimed exempt sales for the second quarter of 2002. Now, the second quarter of 2002, you may recall from our briefing, is the quarter where we had the missing records. We had a computer crash that was the result of an accounting software transition that resulted in the loss of the overwhelming amount of data that would have ordinarily been available for the second quarter of 2002. And the issue in this case is, how do we treat claimed exempt sales for that second quarter with the missing records? With respect to the 11 out of 12 quarters where we did have records, the department tested for claimed exempt sales using a statistical sample that was within the guidelines provided by this board. It was conducted with a computer audit specialist within the margins of error that this board allows. And the results of that statistical sample that tested transactions randomly over the course of the 11 quarters with records was a composite 1.67% error rate. And what the department did with respect to the 11 quarters with records is it took the results of that sample and projected it across all the transactions for the 11 quarters using the 1.67% error rate. So now the question becomes, well, what do we do in a situation where we don't have records? Fortunately, your board has provided guidance for taxpayers. This is presumably not the first time records have been lost, because there's an audit manual section that your board has published and provided to the staff as guidance for precisely this type of a situation. And what we do have up there to your right is a blown up portion of the audit manual. It is also behind tab 2 of your materials. And what it states quite simply is, in the highlighted portion, in some instances, results from a statistical sample are projected to areas outside the defined population. This might occur if only 1 or 2 years of documentation are available in a 3-year audit period. That's what the audit manual says. Essentially, take the results of the sample and apply it to the period with the missing records. Now, the audit manual contemplates lost records in a much larger quantity than we have here. In fact, if you continue to read this relevant portion of the audit manual, it says that you can project as few as 4 quarters in an audit period onto 8. And what we've asked staff to do here in this situation is project 11 quarters, the results of a statistical sample for 11 quarters, onto just 1. Clearly within the guidance provided by the board. And if you were to do that, then that's where this chart in the middle comes in. It's behind tab 4 of your materials. green represents the results of the statistical sample for claimed exempt sales. The purple represents what would have happened if the staff had simply projected the results of the error onto the second quarter of 2002. And the red represents what the staff actually did. Now, the staff explains why it didn't project the results of the stat sample. And if you look behind tab 3 of your materials, you can see exactly why. This is dated July 5th, 2006, and it's Schedule 12F. If you look at the second box on the bottom, it says the result of statistical sampling for exempt sales are not applied to the 2Q02 because the taxable sales and exempt sales for 2Q02 are based on actual basis. And that was the position of the department back in 2006, and that was the position of the department for the ensuing 8 years, all the way up until when? Up until this case was ready for hearing last year in February of 2014. The department took another look at this issue. We've been saying it till we're blue in the face. There was no actual basis audit. And why am I saying? I'm not saying that to throw stones at the department. I'm saying that because that was the stated reason for not applying the sample. Okay? And the department took a look at this again in February of last year, and lo and behold, turned to tab 7. Pulled the case and said, based on additional review, this is in the box at the bottom, the department concluded that not all sales invoices for the second quarter 2002 have been reviewed. So the natural conclusion that we thought would happen from that point forward, that's the stated reason for not applying the sample. That reason no longer exists. We're going to apply the sample, right? Case is over. Should have been over, but that's not what happened. Instead, this is what happened. Again, nothing has changed on the legend. The red represents what the staff did. The purple represents what the results of the statistical sample would have produced in terms of claimed exempt sales for the second quarter of 2002. And you can see the green, which is the ebb and flow of the claimed exempt sales error based on the stat sample for the remaining 11 quarters. And as you can see, what we've proposed is consistent and reasonable and within the ebb and flow and is in sync with the rest of the audit period. What staff has proposed is not. They went from $2.8 million in claimed exempt sales in the first go-around, which, by the way, is more than twice the amount of claimed exempt sales error for the other 11 quarters combined. And they went down to a slightly less unreasonable $1.4 million, which is, again, more than the error for the other 11 quarters combined, $1.3 million for the other 11 quarters. And so why did they do that? We don't know, and I'm sure the department, I'm not going to be presumptuous, wait to hear what they have to say, but this is what we have in the record as the reason as to why it didn't apply the sample. It's just as simple as this. If you continue to read behind tab 7 in the little box, it just says the department concludes that the audited taxable percentage from the subsequent periods with records would be more accurate to establish the second quarter 2002's audited taxable measure at this time. We really don't know what that means, but what we know what it represents, and it represents $1.4 million worth of error. This is about claimed exempt sales, not audited taxable measure. The case is a simple one. It's very straightforward. We're asking for staff to simply implement this board's guidance as set forth in the audit manual. And if you do that, the measure of tax works out to around $70,000. And that's what we would respectfully request. And we'll reserve all further time for questions from the members. Thank you. There have been a lot of points that were made, and so I'm going to try and address the points that we think are the most important. First of all, the issue before the board is disallowed exempt sales for the second quarter of 2002. If you look behind tab 7, you can see how these issues are laid out in the audit work papers. We're not talking about recorded versus reported, although I can address that as well. We're talking about disallowed claimed exempt sales. And why we are revisiting an issue 9 years later, when on July 5th of 2006, the department said the reason that we didn't apply the sample, i.e., the reason we didn't follow the board's instructions in the audit manual, is because we conducted the audit on an actual basis, That was the stated reason. The clear implication is, were that not the case, we should be projecting the results of the sample. And we have February of 2014, with that ocean of blue that you see behind us passing, the department coming to the realization that we didn't examine the transaction on an actual basis. And the 56 transactions consist of scores of invoices per project. So it's not enough to say we looked at 56 transactions, ergo, therefore, this is an actual basis audit. It wasn't. And so in the absence of an actual basis, you should be projecting. That's what the audit manual says. And you can see the results sort of speak for themselves. I mean, what we're requesting is within the range of reasonableness. Some periods are higher, yes, some periods are lower. But what the department is proposing is out of all proportion to the claimed exempt sales for the remainder of the audit period. It just doesn't make any sense. So I'm still at a loss as to why this method was applied. And, you know, with respect to the recorded versus reported difference, I didn't bring this up in my opening, but again, this issue was decided back in July of 2006. If you go and you look behind tab 3 and you look at the top quote that's highlighted, it says reconciliation of recorded taxable sales to the reported resulted in zero difference. This was the result after an audit that took place of this taxpayer that was about a year and change. Back in 2006, this was the position of the department. Why are we revisiting this now? I don't have an answer. And one last comment on the recorded versus reported. You know, you will note as you go through that line item, even though it's not at issue, even though it was resolved back in 2006, that on substance, there are wild swings from quarter to quarter based on this cash versus accrual point that Mr. Lambert was making. So it's totally unfair to try and attribute any sort of positive adjustment in favor of the department on that when it's just as likely, as you look, you can see many negative adjustments. It is just as likely, perhaps even more so, that there was a negative adjustment in that quarter. And ultimately, that's why I have to believe that was left at zero back in 2006.
For the taxpayer, will you explain one time again how it is that the Tutor Perini contract and the LA Power contract were reported?
Well, what I can tell you about the Tudor-Saliba contract is that it was a direct pay arrangement.
Okay, so that was not taxable.
That was not taxable. Those payments were made directly to the board.
Okay.
What's perhaps even more straightforward is that this issue was examined back in 2006, and I don't know why we are revisiting issues that were already determined at audit, like recorded versus reported sales, because the department feels like it right now. That's not appropriate tax policy or procedure, nor is it reasonable given what we know. And what we know is that the department said in 2006, this audit is being conducted on an actual basis, otherwise we'd be applying the sample. I cannot let the department run from that right now. They need to own up to that. In 2006, that's what they said. Now they fess up 8 years later after my client has been through, very patient, and been through a long administrative process, and now their position is, okay, oops, we didn't do it on an actual basis, but we're still not going to follow the audit manual. And that's how we see the case right now. I can appreciate the comment from appeals. The goal of the agency is to get it right whenever you can, if that happens earlier or later in the process. Here's our concern. From the moment that we were involved in this case, and even before that, this issue stuck out as a sore thumb. This was something that we picked up on right away and brought to the attention of whoever would listen to us at that time. Believe me, we brought it up repeatedly throughout the process, and it fell on deaf ears. I'm grateful that on the eve of the hearing, the department owned up and said, yeah, guess what? We made a mistake. We didn't review it on an actual basis. But for them to then just shift the method and go away from what they had said several years earlier about the reason why they didn't apply the sample and come up with a new theory, that's where I think it becomes difficult for taxpayers and their representatives. So better late than never, perhaps, but I still don't think we got it right. And yeah, and so there was even dissension within the department as to whether this was the appropriate methodology. But that's behind us. That's long since passed, and we're here today trying to get it right. And we believe the method that we proposed.
Is there anything
You said something about you had been saying all along that it wasn't done on an actual basis, and you were calling whomever you can call or write.
Yes.
When did you start that process? Was it in 2009?
We weren't involved in the initial decision and recommendation. We came in shortly after it was issued, and in our response, when we requested reconsideration, we made the point that it wasn't done on an actual basis. How could it? The records were lost for that quarter. So what are we talking about? We have a sales history report, yes. That shows contracts, it shows invoice numbers and invoice amounts, but it doesn't show actual invoices. We did the best we could and provided what we could. And for the department now, I think the call of the question was, why change now? And I didn't hear a satisfactory answer to that.